It was Christmas Eve, not Thanksgiving, not some ordinary dinner. Christmas Eve. The night when the whole world is supposed to smell like pine and cinnamon, and the particular warmth of people who choose to be together. The night when even families who have spent 11 months avoiding each other sit down and pretend, for a few hours, that love is enough to paper over everything that has cracked between them. The Ward Mansion in the hills above Greenwich, Connecticut, blazed with light so warm and deliberate that from the road it looked like a painting. The kind that wealthy people commission to hang in offices so visitors understand immediately what kind of person they are dealing with. Inside, a string quartet played Vivaldi in the east corner of the great room. Servers moved between guests carrying champagne flutes on silver trays. The dining table seated 22 people beneath a chandelier that my son had told me, with a pride I found both touching and slightly sad, had been custom imported from Venice. I, Elizabeth S. Holloway, 72 years old, sat at the far end of that table, not near my son, not near the center where laughter gathered and conversations crossed and the evening felt alive. At the far end, the quiet end, the end where you sit when you have been invited for appearances but not for belonging. I was wearing the navy dress I had worn to my retirement dinner 14 years earlier. It still fit. I had always been careful about such things. Careful about money, careful about space, careful above all about not being more than I was expected to be. My name had once meant something in rooms like this. Different rooms, but rooms where decisions were made and things were built. I had spent 37 years as a cardiothoracic surgical nurse at Yale New Haven Hospital. I had stood at the operating table for procedures that lasted 9, 10, 11 hours. I had held instruments with hands that did not shake while surgeons reconstructed the muscle of a human heart. I had, on 4 separate occasions over my career, been the calmest person in a room where someone was dying, and calm was the only thing that could change the outcome. But none of that was visible in the navy dress at the far end of the Christmas table. What was visible was a 72-year-old woman who did not fit the room, whose wine glass was too close to the edge of the table, whose hands, after a lifetime of surgical precision, now sometimes betrayed her with the slight tremor that comes with age and cannot be willed away no matter how firmly you believe it can. The tremor at 9:47 p.m. My daughter-in-law, Victoria, was in the middle of a story. One of those stories that wealthy people tell at dinner parties, about a trip or a purchase or an experience that is meant to communicate something about who they are. She was wearing a dress that her husband, my son Christopher, had given her for Christmas morning, unwrapped early because she had insisted on wearing it to the party. White. Silk. The kind of white that announces itself. She had mentioned the designer twice. She had mentioned the price once, just loudly enough. $19,000, she had said, with the particular smile of someone who wants the number heard but does not want to appear to want it heard. But honestly, for something you'll wear for the rest of your life, it's really an investment. Laughter, agreement, the clink of glasses, and then the tremor. The glass slipped from my hand the way things slip when your body has decided, without consulting you, that it has held on long enough. The red wine, a Bordeaux that Christopher had mentioned 3 times, was 20 years old, moved through the air in what felt, in the terrible slow motion of disaster, like an entirely avoidable arc. It landed on Victoria's dress. The entire table went silent. The string quartet did not stop. Vivaldi continued, indifferent, which somehow made it worse. Victoria stood. She did not rush toward me. She rose with a deliberateness that was more frightening than anger, the deliberateness of someone who has been given by fate exactly the moment they have been waiting for. "Do you have any idea?" she began. "Victoria," Christopher said. No, her voice was controlled. almost quiet, the tone of someone who has decided that volume would be a concession. No, $19,000, Christopher. Your mother just ruined a $19,000 dress, and you want me to what, smile? She turned to me. Her eyes were not angry. They were something worse than angry. They were the eyes of a woman who has decided that you are not worth anger, that you are simply a problem that has been tolerated for too long. I think, she said precisely, that you should go. I looked at my son. Christopher's jaw was set. His hands were flat on the table. He was looking at his wife, not at me, and I watched his face move through a series of expressions. Discomfort, calculation, something that might have been shame, and then settle into something I recognized and would not soon forget. Compliance. Mom, he said, and then nothing else. Just my name offered to the room as if it were an apology and an instruction simultaneously. I stood. My legs did not shake. My voice did not break. I had spent 37 years cultivating the ability to remain functional under conditions that would unravel most people, and whatever else had changed in my body, that had not. I'm sorry about the dress, I said to Victoria, to the room, to the 22 people who were all very carefully not looking at me. I picked up my handbag from the back of my chair, and as I did, as I bent slightly, the way you bend when you're retrieving something from the floor beside a chair at a crowded table, I felt something against my foot, small, hard. I looked down. A silver USB drive. It had fallen from somewhere. Victoria's chair, I thought. Her bag, perhaps, which had been hanging from the armrest and had swung when she stood. I picked it up. No one was watching me. They were watching Victoria, who was being escorted to the powder room by two of her closest friends, the red wine spreading across the silk of the dress, like something that could not be undone. I put the USB in my pocket. I walked to the front door. I stepped out into the December cold, and the door closed behind me on the sound of Vivaldi and laughter resuming, the party healing over the small rupture of my presence, the way water heals over a stone that has been dropped into it. I sat in my car for 8 minutes. I did not cry. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, the hands that had assisted in more than 4,000 cardiac surgeries, that had held equipment with a steadiness that surgeons had trusted their patients' lives to, and I thought about the tremor, about how the body after a certain point stops asking your permission before it reminds you of what you are. Then I thought about the USB drive in my coat pocket, and something shifted. Not anger. Something quieter and more dangerous than anger. Attention. My apartment in Hartford was the kind of apartment that announces its inhabitant has chosen necessity over appearance. 1 bedroom. A study I had converted from the 2nd bedroom after Christopher left for college and never came back to live with me. A kitchen that smelled of chamomile and whatever I had last cooked, which was usually something simple, something a person cooks when they're cooking only for themselves. I made tea. I sat at the desk in the study. I looked at the USB drive for a long time. Then I plugged it in. The folder that opened contained no photographs, no videos, no personal correspondence of the kind that people assume when they think of secrets kept on small silver drives. What it contained was financial data, spreadsheets, PDF documents with titles that were dry and professional and entirely unremarkable to anyone who did not know how to read them. I knew how to read them. 37 years in a hospital system teaches you things that are not in the nursing curriculum. It teaches you to read budgets and billing records and the particular language of institutional money. It teaches you what legitimate financial documentation looks like. And by contrast, what documentation looks like when someone has been very careful to make it appear legitimate. The files on the USB drive appeared legitimate. They were not. I recognized the name of my son's company immediately. Holloway Biomedical Solutions, a medical device firm Christopher had built over 12 years, starting with seed funding I had provided from the sale of my home and the entirety of my retirement savings. The company that bore our family name. The company I had believed, when I wrote those checks with hands that did not shake even then, was the beginning of something that would last. The financial records showed a pattern I had seen once before, years earlier, in a hospital system audited for Medicare fraud. I had not understood it fully then. I understood it now. Money flowing from Holloway Biomedical's Research and Development Fund, a fund designated for the development of a pediatric cardiac monitoring device, a project Christopher had described to me with more animation than I had seen from him in years, into a series of accounts overseas. Switzerland, the Cayman Islands, an entity called Meridian Health Ventures that appeared nowhere in any public record I could find. 41 transactions over 14 months. Total, $23.4 million. The authorizing signature on every transaction was the same. Victoria Holloway, Chief Financial Officer. I sat back in my chair. The screen glowed blue in the dark study. Outside, the first snow of Christmas morning was beginning to fall, soft and indifferent, covering the parking lot below in something that looked, from above, like forgiveness. I thought about the pediatric cardiac monitoring device, about the children it was supposed to help, about the parents who had trusted through their donations to the research fund that the money was going where Christopher had told them it was going. I thought about my son's face at the dinner table, that particular expression, compliance, and what it meant in this context. Whether he knew, whether he had been told and had chosen not to look, whether Victoria had been careful enough to keep him in the dark entirely, I did not know yet, but I knew someone who could help me find out. I had not spoken to Dr. Margaret Voss in 4 years. Margaret had been a colleague, a cardiologist at Yale New Haven, brilliant and precise and possessed of a moral clarity that could be exhausting in small doses and essential in large ones. We had worked together for 11 years. We had been, in the particular way of hospital friendships, close in the way that people are close when they share the specific knowledge of what a human body requires to survive. She answered on the third ring. Elizabeth? Her voice was warm and alert simultaneously. The voice of someone who has spent decades being woken with bad news and has learned to be present before the second word. It's 2 a.m. on Christmas Day. Tell me, I told her. I described the files, the amounts, the account names, the authorization signatures. Margaret was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You need someone who does forensic financial investigation, not a reporter. Not yet. Someone who can verify what you're looking at before you do anything with it." I said, "Do you know anyone?" She said, "I know someone who owes me a favor. His name is Richard Holt. He is the most meticulous person I have ever met, and the only forensic accountant I have ever trusted with anything that mattered." "Can he be trusted with this?" Margaret's answer was immediate. "Richard Holt has never in 22 years done anything other than exactly what he said he would do. If you give him the drive, he will tell you exactly what you have. Nothing more and nothing less." I said, "Call him." Richard Holt arrived at my apartment at 11 o'clock the following morning. He was 65, small and neat, with the bearing of a man who had spent his entire career in rooms where imprecision was dangerous. He wore glasses on a cord. He carried a weathered briefcase. He shook my hand with both of his and said, "Dr. Voss told me something about what you may have found. I want you to understand, Mrs. Holloway, that I do not form opinions in advance of seeing evidence. I am going to look at what you have and tell you what it is. That is all I can promise." I said, "That's exactly what I need." He sat at my desk for 4 hours. I made tea. I sat in the living room. I watched the snow continue to fall outside and tried not to think about Christopher. who had texted me at 8 that morning. "Mom, are you okay? I'm sorry about last night. Victoria feels terrible." I had not responded. I could not yet know what Victoria felt. I only knew what she had done. Richard emerged from the study at 3 in the afternoon. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He removed his glasses and cleaned them in the methodical way he seemed to do everything. Then he said, "Mrs. Holloway, what you have is substantial. These are not accounting irregularities. This is a systematic and deliberate diversion of funds from a designated research account to personal and intermediary accounts, authorized consistently by one individual. The pattern is clear. The documentation is, if anything, more complete than such records usually are." I asked, "Why would she keep records this detailed?" Richard said, "Because she believed they were safe. Because she kept them on a drive she controlled and considered secure. Because people who are very good at deception sometimes become careless about the containers in which they keep their secrets." I thought about the USB falling from Victoria's bag at the dinner table. The moment I had bent down to retrieve my handbag, I thought, sometimes fate moves in ways that look like accidents. I asked, "What does this mean for my son's company?" Richard was quiet for a moment. "If this is what it appears to be, the company's research fund has been significantly compromised. The pediatric device project." He paused. "The funding for that project has been redirected. The project, as currently resourced, cannot proceed." I sat with that for a moment. The weight of it, the particular cruelty of it, not just the money, not just the fraud, but the children who were supposed to be helped by a device that would now not exist because the money had been moved to an account in Switzerland. I said, "What do I do next?" Richard said, "You have 2 options. You take this to law enforcement, or you take it to someone who will make certain it cannot be buried." "Can those 2 things happen simultaneously?" He looked at me for a moment. "Yes," he said, "if done carefully and in the right order." I had not spoken to Patricia Crane in 6 years. Patricia had been a patient. Room 412, Cardiac Care Unit, Yale, New Haven, March of 2017. She had come in with what she thought was indigestion and what turned out to be a left anterior descending artery blockage, the kind they call the widowmaker, for reasons that do not require explanation. She was 51 years old and had been at the time 3 weeks from the publication of her first book, a financial exposé that had taken her 7 years to research and write. I had been her primary nurse for 11 days. We had talked during the long hours of recovery in the way that patients and nurses sometimes talk. Honestly, without the social filters that health applies to most conversations, because when you have nearly died, you do not have much patience for pretense. She had given me her card when she was discharged. "If you ever need someone who knows how to handle something that people with power would prefer stayed quiet," she had said, "call me." I had put the card in the wooden box at the back of my desk drawer. I had not thought about it for 6 years. I thought about it now. Patricia answered before the second ring. Her voice was exactly as I remembered. Quick, direct, with the particular energy of someone who has spent a career in pursuit of things people are hiding. "Elizabeth Holloway," she said, "I was thinking about you recently. How are you?" I said, "I have something. It's significant, and I need someone who knows how to handle it correctly." Patricia said, "Tell me," I told her. The silence that followed was not hesitation. It was the silence of a person absorbing information rapidly and organizing it into categories. Then Patricia said, "How complete is the documentation?" "Complete enough that a forensic accountant spent 4 hours reviewing it and told me it was more thorough than records in cases of this type usually are." "And your son, does he know?" "I don't know yet." Another pause. "Elizabeth, this involves your son's company, his name, your family name. Do you understand what releasing this will do?" I said. I understand what not releasing it has already done. There are children who were supposed to have a cardiac monitoring device that will now not exist. There are donors who trusted their money to a fund that was being used for something else entirely. I spent 37 years making sure hearts kept beating. I am not going to look away from something that makes that impossible. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, here's what we do." The plan had 3 stages. The first stage was verification. Patricia connected me with a second forensic accountant, a woman named Diana Torres, who had testified in 11 federal fraud cases and whose analysis would carry weight in any proceeding, who spent 2 days with copies of the drive's contents. Her conclusion matched Richard's completely. The second stage was documentation of the chain of custody. Richard prepared a sworn affidavit describing how he had received the drive, what he had found, and the methodology of his analysis. I prepared my own account, written, dated, notarized, of how and when I had found the drive. The third stage was the question of Christopher. I did not want to destroy my son. I need to say that clearly, in the way that things must be said clearly when they are the truth, and when people might otherwise assume the opposite. I did not do what I did because I wanted to punish Christopher. I did not do it because of the Christmas Eve dinner, because of the navy dress, because of the particular expression on his face when he said my name and nothing else. I did it because 37 years of cardiac nursing had taught me that when something is wrong with a heart, you do not treat the symptoms. You go to the source. And the source of what was wrong in my family was not the wine-stained dress, or the quiet end of the table, or the Christmas party, or any of the accumulated small humiliations of the past several years. The source was a secret, and secrets, in my experience, always cost more the longer they are kept. I called Christopher on the morning of December 28th. I told him I needed to see him, alone, without Victoria. He arrived at my apartment at 2 o'clock. He was wearing clothes that looked like he had not slept in them, but had also not slept without them. The particular dishevelment of someone caught between 2 states. He had lost weight since the last time I had really looked at him. Not dramatically, but enough that I noticed the way you notice things about people whose bodies you have watched change over 44 years. He sat across from me at the kitchen table. He started to say something about Christmas Eve, about Victoria, about the dress. I said, "Christopher, I need you to look at something before we talk about anything else." I opened the laptop. I turned it to face him. I watched his face. The process of watching your child understand something they did not know is one of the most particular experiences a parent can have. Not because of the understanding itself, but because of what comes before it. The moment when the face moves from confusion to recognition to something that is not yet fully formed. Something that is still in the space between not knowing and knowing. Christopher's face moved through those stages over the course of 20 minutes. He read slowly. He scrolled. He went back to the first file and read it again. He opened the folder labeled Meridian Health Ventures and looked at the account numbers for a long time. Then he looked up. "Mom?" His voice was the voice of a man who has just been handed information that changes the shape of everything he believed about his life. "Where did you get this?" I told him. "The dinner table. The drive falling from Victoria's bag." The moment I bent down to retrieve my handbag, he looked back at the screen. "These are her signatures. Yes. Everyone. Yes." He pressed his hands flat on the table, the gesture of a person trying to keep themselves from moving when everything inside them wants to. "Did she... was any of this?" He stopped, started again. "The Pediatric Device Project. The Donor Fund." "Christopher," I said, "the project has been defunded, not officially. No one has announced it, but the money that was designated for it has been redirected." He looked at me. To where? Offshore accounts tied to an entity that appears, based on what the forensic accountants found, to be connected to a competitor acquisition. The silence that followed was the silence of a man learning something that cannot be unlearned. Then he said, "I didn't know." I looked at my son, 44 years old, successful by every external measure, wearing clothes he had slept in, looking smaller than he had looked since the morning I had driven him to his first day of high school, and watched him walk through the doors with his shoulders back and his hands in his pockets, pretending not to be afraid. "I know you didn't," I said. "How do you know?" "Because you're not good at hiding things that matter. You never were. Since you were 4 years old, when you were carrying something heavy, it showed on your face." He pressed his fingers against his eyes. "What do I do?" I said. "You're going to cooperate fully with the investigation. You're going to tell the truth about everything you knew and everything you didn't. And you're going to let the company's name mean what it was supposed to mean. Not because of what it's produced or how much it's worth, but because the people who gave money to that pediatric fund deserve to know what happened to it." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "And Victoria?" "That," I said carefully, "is a decision only you can make. But I will tell you this. The woman you married is not the woman I am describing in those files, and you are going to have to decide which one you believe." Patricia Crane published the investigation on January 14th. The headline read, "The Other Heart: How a Pediatric Cardiac Fund Became a Vehicle for Offshore Financial Fraud." It did not mention my name. Patricia had been careful about that. Careful about protecting the chain of evidence. Careful about making the story about the fraud and its victims, rather than about the family drama that surrounded it. The article cited forensic analysis, documented transactions, and multiple expert sources. It was the kind of journalism that cannot be argued with because it is built on the kind of evidence that does not change its story, depending on who is reading it. The response was immediate and total. By noon, Holloway Biomedical stock had dropped 41%. By 3 o'clock, the SEC had opened a preliminary inquiry. By 6, Victoria's attorney had released a statement describing the allegations as a malicious and coordinated attack on an innocent woman by a family member with a documented history of hostility. The documented history of hostility, I noted, was a wine stain on a Christmas dress. I sat in my apartment and watched the news cycle turn. My phone rang throughout the day. Numbers I didn't recognize. One number I recognized immediately but did not answer for several hours. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I wanted to choose the right moment. When I finally answered Victoria's call, her voice was different from anything I had heard from her before. Not the controlled precision of the dinner table, not the icy sweetness of the gate outside their home. Something rawer. Something that had been stripped of its surface by the particular pressure of a collapsing situation. "You did this," she said. "I found the drive," I said. "Everything after that was done by people who do their jobs honestly. You destroyed my family." I said, "Victoria, the family was already being destroyed. I only made the process visible. You don't know what you've done." "I know exactly what I've done," I said. "I've made it possible for the parents who donated to the pediatric fund to know where their money actually went. I've made it possible for the device to be funded through legitimate sources once the fraud is corrected. I've made it possible for my son to know the truth about his own company." Silence on the line. Then, very quietly, "I needed that money." I held the phone and let that sentence sit between us for a moment. Because it was not the sentence I had expected. It was not defiance or strategy or the continued performance of innocence. It was the sentence of a person who had, in some essential way, run out of the energy required to be anything other than honest. "What did you need it for?" I asked. Another silence. My parents' debts, my father, his medical costs. He's been ill for 3 years. The bills. She stopped. It was never supposed to be. Another stop. It got out of hand. I sat with that for a long time. There is a particular kind of ache that comes from understanding why someone did something that hurt you. It does not make the hurt smaller, but it changes its shape. Victoria, I said, I am sorry about your father. I am genuinely sorry about your father. But the money you took was given by people who trusted that it was going to help sick children. That is not something that can be explained by what you needed. She said nothing. I said, get a good lawyer. Tell them the truth. All of it. I ended the call. I sat in the quiet of my apartment for a long time. Outside, January was doing what January does in Connecticut. Gray and cold and relentless, without apology. I thought about a child with a cardiac arrhythmia, about the monitoring device that was supposed to help catch it before it became a crisis, about the parents who had written checks to a fund because they believed in something and had been let down by someone they had no reason to distrust. I thought about 37 years of standing at an operating table while a surgeon worked on a heart, about the particular understanding that comes from that proximity, that a heart is more fragile than people believe and more resilient than people fear, and that what it requires more than anything is someone willing to pay attention. I am still paying attention, I thought. That has not changed.